Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. We're going to let people jump on and then we'll jump in at about 9:01, 9:02. Just give people a couple minutes to get set and on. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Missouri Public Transit Association's Education Series. Today, we're going to hear about the results of the Missouri Statewide Transit Needs Assessment. My name is Kim Sella, and I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Public Transit Association. MPTA transit providers provide more than 42 million rides every year through every county in Missouri, and they employ thousands of individuals living in those communities, both rural and urban. I'd like to welcome the MPTA board members who are joining us via Zoom this morning. Thank you for attending. Your leadership is critical in moving transit forward in the state of Missouri. The Missouri Public Transit Association selected St. Louis-based Lockmuller Group last fall, a full-service survey, planning, engineering, and environmental firm to lead a statewide transit needs assessment study. This was what we felt was a logical next step following our 2019 economic impact study, which really allowed us for the first time ever in the state of Missouri to quantify the benefits of public transit. Now we needed to know where the gaps were. Where are the gaps in service? How do we fill those gaps? What are the costs of those service gaps? So that's where the idea of doing this statewide transit needs assessment came from. Last fall, we launched this study with Lockmuller Group, and today we are going to have the opportunity to hear those findings as well as policy recommendations for moving forward. The firm examined public transit access across Missouri, identified existing and potential service gaps, and helped establish a guide for the development of optimum personal mobility as transit providers are forced to make service modifications and respond to the changing rider demographics that we have in our communities across the state. I'd like to welcome Sean Dykes. He's the Senior Transit Planning Manager at the Lockmuller Group. Sean provides technical and project leadership on a variety of transit service plans and operation studies for transit agencies throughout the Southeast and Midwestern US. He has almost 30 years of transit experience, and we got to see that firsthand over the last 8 to 10 months with Sean asking some very deep questions that we were forced to answer. And I think that really brought some additional information and merit to the study that you're going to hear about today. So today, how we're going to work this is he's going to provide a quick overview of the findings. We will then open it up for questions. Since this is a webinar style Zoom, we ask you to either place your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I will get to those as quickly as we can and make sure we answer as many questions as possible this morning. So with that, welcome everyone. Thank you again to the MPTA board for your leadership on this. And Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks to the board and Michael and Kim, and for your leadership. It's been certainly a interesting project to work on and hopefully a valuable one. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes, thanks.
I don't want to leave. All right, here we go. All right, so I'm going to give you all a briefing, as Kim indicated, on the results of the Missouri Statewide Transit Needs Assessment. Let me advance my slide. There we go. So project overview. So from start to finish, this took about a year. I think we did the initial contract negotiations last July, and we were substantively done at the end of last month. As Kim said, this was very much a collaborative effort with MoDOT, with MPTA, with the agencies, and then with myself and my team. It's not just me. I'm, of course, perhaps the face of the project as the project manager, but I had a team of folks in St. Louis and then throughout the Lockmuller Group who helped me. I think Kim mentioned this was a first of its kind type of study that was undertaken for Missouri, but it was a logical companion piece to the economic impact study that you all have done in the past. So it kind of put the pieces together of, okay, we understand what the impact of transit is in Missouri, and it leverages about a 7-to-1 investment, which we'll see in the subsequent slides. But where are the needs? I think intuitively, every one of us who's connected with transit knows that there's tremendous transit needs out there in terms of more service, more hours, improved service delivery, and certainly newer vehicles. But to quantify that and to really geographically say, where are those needs and how big those are was the point. And then lastly, a focus on what are those big picture needs to elevate really the discussion of transit in the vernacular of decision makers. Certainly all of you on the webinar today, you know what impacts you make day in and day out, but not everyone knows that story. And lots of people in decision-making ability, whether it's your town council or your county government, or certainly at state government, really knows the importance of transit. And we wanted to tell that story. So our project scope was really, somewhat simple, but collaboratively done and addressed all the needs. So we certainly had meetings and engagement of myself and Kim and Michael, along with the board, lots of talk offline and through emails with the agencies to help us collect data. We looked at the demographic profile and developed what we called a mobility needs index. We did an existing conditions snapshot of each agency, which is really service focused, and it was just done at that time. But it was a way to really point out transit reaches all across Missouri and touches many people's lives. How big, how wide, what's the impact? We focused on the number of vehicles, in peak service, drivers, economic impact, and things like that. We also did a mobility needs assessment. Where exactly are those mobility needs and what type are they? Are they programmed or non-programmed? They're really both. We also did the state of good repair or SGR analysis, which really we dove down into the equipment, because that's figuratively and literally where the rubber meets the road in terms of service delivery. If that vehicle can't go out into service, you have to have a replacement. And if you don't have a replacement, that route or that run or those people can't get picked up, and they can't go to the doctor, they can't go to work, they can't go to school, they can't function. And that's a big wrench in the works, and we don't want to do that. As Kim mentioned, we also collaboratively developed policy and program recommendations, and we wanted to make them in terms of short, medium, and long term. And some of them are a little bit of a stretch, and we had a huge stretch in the beginning and we backed off perhaps a little bit. But I'm of the opinion, if you don't shoot for the moon, you won't get there. And if you can't settle for less. So you have to push yourself to do a little bit better. And then lastly, we wrapped it all up into a concise executive summary document that I believe is 5 or 6 pages in length, and then a more lengthy document. And then we have a slew of appendices. If you want to dive deep down into the weeds and the details, we have that for you. So we developed some project guides, if you will, about how do we want to do this? What do we want to go about it? And what do we want to do from the very beginning? So obviously we wanted to have this be statewide in scope and data driven. We wanted the data to tell the actual factual story and to take us where it needed to go. It needed to be factual. It couldn't be Kim or Michael or you all out there at the agency saying, well, I wish it would be this way. That's why you hired us to have the third party impartial firm to do this. We want at the end of the day to assist local and regional agencies with their planning. Hopefully this is a good planning tool that you all can use collectively and individually, and then to take that to your decision makers to help you better deliver your service on a day in and day out basis. Again, we wanted to identify where those gaps are, where the service area is. Is it service quantity? Is it assets and funding? At the end of the day, as you'll see in subsequent slides, really it's all that. This, in some regards, is a guidebook for future mobility enhancements across Missouri. It's also done to prioritize the investments. And again, as I said before, to elevate the discussion of transit, but ultimately the goal is to better deliver those services to customers and communities throughout Missouri, and to keep making a positive impact for people who depend on transit or people who are thinking about transit. And it's the big agencies in St. Louis or in Kansas City, and it's the smaller agencies, and it's everyone else in between. This is really your study. So the key findings, in a nutshell, we saw that every day about 2,000 vehicles across Missouri, administered, planned, and operated by more than 4,500 workers, transports about 156,000 people. And that's each day. That's a big impact. The direct and indirect impact of transit in Missouri is a $3.6 billion enterprise, which equals roughly a 7-to-1 return on investment. So for every dollar that gets invested at all levels, it's about a 7 return, which is bigger than the traditional average across the US, which I think is on the order of 4 to 5. However, as we all know, transit spending per capita in Missouri is currently at 28 cents per person, well below the peer average, which is $7.34. Although things have gotten better recently, I've heard. So we're back to some previous levels, which was great, but there's still a little bit of work to be done. And I'll show you in a slide, in all honesty, our friends over in Illinois, up in the Chicagoland area, they skew the numbers a little bit, but we wanted to put that in. Also currently, as many of you know, there's an acute labor shortage for operators, mechanics, and vehicle maintainers. So many of you all I know are short drivers, you're short mechanics, and you're short maintainers. As soon as you get a driver in, you get them trained up on air brakes with a passenger endorsement, they leave to go to FedEx or Amazon or somebody else who unfortunately pays more. And it's a constant turnover and a battle to keep them trained in all the things that you need, plus all the FTA requirements. And it's all you can do just to get the vehicle with a competent, safe, experienced driver out the door. I very well feel your pain. Unmet transit needs are virtually in every corner of the state and are estimated at about 39 million more rides a year, which are needed. To cover 100% of that would be about $341 million more in today's dollars. And that's especially needed in non-urban areas for the non-program trips. So just to make sure we're clear, our definition of non-program trips are those trips for individuals who don't otherwise qualify for something else. So not Medicare, not Medicaid, not VA, or some special program as defined by other types of laws in the FTA, the ADA, or other types of citizens. So these are just folks who need to go to the store. Maybe they don't have a car. They want to go to the doctor. They don't have a ride that day. They just need to get where they're going. Vehicle needs are also acute and are exacerbated by COVID with the supply chain issue and due to the chip shortages. So I know if we could magically have Joe's bus lot and you could go down there with a checkbook full of money or a pocket full of money, there's no vehicles to be had. And the lead time now on vehicles we're seeing gets doubled or sometimes even tripled. And the prices are going up too. Currently, there's more than $240 million in unmet vehicle needs when using the FTA's useful life benchmark, which is basically to have no vehicle out of compliance. And that's that's in current dollars as well. So all told, if my math is right, that's about almost $600 million in needs, both from a service delivery and a vehicle side. So that's a tremendous need in Missouri. You're not alone. There's many other states that are just in this type of shape, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Here is the transit funding per capita slide that I talked about, and it's skewed heavily by our friends in Illinois. But if you look where I currently sit today, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. We're not much better than you guys. So misery does company, and we got to get our act together as well. But you can see where the peer averages are and why they are that way. Although recently, I know you've made some really good headway in that avenue. So the mobility needs determination, what data did we use? So we looked at really the typical ones that we use in the transit industry that in some regards are a transit propensity index or a transit needs index. So we looked at population density, We looked at population of folks 65 and over. We looked at population of folks 18 and under, because those are segments that typically don't drive anymore or don't have access to a car. We looked at folks with a disability, self-described, no matter what it is, that perhaps precluded them from using a car or using other types of transportation. People in poverty, we looked at that as well. And we looked at workers who otherwise didn't fit in one of those categories, but they didn't have access to a vehicle. So the zero car households also tell us. Typically, when you stratify these and you have an individual who falls into one or more of the categories, that's a pretty big indicator with the R-square value that they need transit services for a variety of reasons, whatever that is. Let me go to the next slide. So this was our composite transit needs index that we came up with. And if you look, the yellows are the lower needs index, and the shades of blue are the higher needs. There are some service providers that we know, such as Oates, that they serve multiple counties and they're in a much larger geographic area. But this figure really illustrates to some extent where the need is not being met. Of the 115 counties in the state, 73 have what we termed as a high need or in a high need zip code. And it was greater than the mobility needs index average of the state, which is 1.53. So there's lots of needs throughout the state. And I don't think this should be a surprise really to anyone. Go to the next slide. So how did we determine that mobility needs index? So we looked at large urban systems, small urban systems, and rural systems. And there was a different methodology for all three, because the situations and the data that's driven determine the mobility needs index is different. For large urban systems, it was based on a comparative analysis of similar peer systems in the US. So the Federal Transit Administration has a peer tool that you could say, okay, St. Louis Metro by state, what is a similar peer system to them across the US that's similar in types of service delivery, the services that they have, and the miles and hours. So it examines the potential demand based upon those parameters and says, since you have a system that have these types of characteristics, this is how much demand you should have. And you compare that demand with what's being put out there, and the delta is the needs index. Similarly, for the small urban systems, it's a formula-based approach that examines some slightly different service characteristics. It looks at population and major trip generators. So we look at the population indices that we showed before, as well as trip generators, such as shopping malls and schools, colleges, multifamily apartments, manufacturing facilities, clusters of hospitals, or maybe restaurants and other things we know that are kind of in that hospitality realm, where we see transit being very effective in getting workers there. Lastly, the rural systems was, again, a formula-based approach, but it examines the demographics more in tune with the mobility needs assessment or index. So I want to be clear, this is not derived from any type of sophisticated travel demand forecasting model. It really shows the potential demand indicated by the number of trips compared to the existing ridership. And it's a relative, it should be taken as a relative benchmark and not necessarily absolute numbers. And I hope that makes sense. So in terms of where those unmet needs are and how big and how wide, there's statewide needs, large urban, small city, rural general, and rural program. And again, the rural general is the trips that aren't qualified, Medicare, Medicaid, VA, or some other type of program. And then the program trips are those types of trips. All told, again, just slightly over 39 million trips. And if you look at the cost of serving 100% of the trips, it'd be $342 million. And I got an extra zero in my number there, 2022. Apologize for that. Or to serve half of it is 171. And we also have this broken down by urban, which we've broken out Kansas City and St. Louis. And then at the request of Kim and other folks, we also geographically broke this out by state house and Senate geographies. So you could go to your elected official and say, in our geography that you have jurisdiction or representation over, this is how many people. And we have all the data behind it to drive all of those decisions. And I'll let this slide stay up for a minute just so everybody can absorb it. It'll let me on the other screen too fix my mistake there as well. All right, I'm going to move ahead. So in terms of rural general unmet demand, here is where it is. So as you can see, the yellow boxes indicate none, and we'd have to dig into that a little bit more, but that's what the data told us. That greenish, greater than 25,000 trips, all the way up to more than 150,000 needed trips. And you could see in virtually every corner of the state, there are needs, whether that's rural or ex-urban, close to the more urbanized areas, there is a need. Here's unmet rural demand by political district. And the Missouri State House is there on the left. And the Senate geographies are there on the right. And this, what we've done here is we've monetized it. Where are the needs in terms of money of service delivery? Before it was the number of trips throughout the state, and now this has been monetized. Kim, how are we doing on time? Doing okay?
Yes, we're doing great.
Okay.
And just as a quick reminder, Sean, before you move on, everyone on the webinar, please feel free to place your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will get to them. And it is $1.41 per capita as of last Thursday, Sean. So I did want to make sure we got that number out there. It's also in the chat box.
All right, that's great. So that's a 5x increase, if my math is right, or 4 something increase?
We have it at about 400% plus.
All right. I was doing some quick math in my head. So that's on the demand side. So if we look at the vehicle side, state of good repair, overall, there's good adherence to the transit asset management plans statewide. Those are mandated, the TAM plans mandated by the FTA. MoDOT's benchmark is not as rigid as the FTA's. MoDOT looks at the standard and says if 45% of the vehicles are beyond the useful life, that's where they want to be. When you look, there's not many issues because 46% of the cutaway vehicles, and I know that's what many of you out there, especially in the rural parts of the state, are running, that 46% of them are beyond their useful life. I know, though, it's probably a struggle every day to get some of those vehicles going and to maintain them. And when they get older beyond the useful life, they get more expensive. And they're already kind of expensive to begin with. And to be perfectly honest, those Ford F-250s and 350s, those chassis, they take a beating. And so does the bodies. And everyone knows it. So what the FTA in response to that wants, they want 100% of the vehicles not beyond the useful life benchmark. And you can see there in the chart, that is the useful life benchmark from the FTA in terms of how long vehicles ought to last. And the cutaway bus is 10 years. And I would bet dollars to donuts that there's many of you out there that have vehicles that are much older than 10 years. So the replacement cost, if you look at it from MoDOT, is fairly modest at only $582,000. If we ramp it up and we look at what the FTA wants us to do, and that's what we focused on, that cost is more than $220 million in today's dollars. So it's estimated that the annual replacement cost would be about $35 million. And we set a smooth 12-year replacement curve, which is a little bit more than the useful benchmark of the 10 years, because we know we're having trouble with the vehicle manufacturing pipeline because of the labor shortage, materials, and chips. So that's what we've done. So it would take roughly about 35 million a year from, in 2022 all the way for 12 years out to get all those vehicles replaced, if they were available and the funding was available. And those are two big caveats I realize now in today's day and age with what's going on. I'm going to go to the next slide. So the goals and recommendations. So these were driven by the data. They were collaboratively developed by us as the consultant team, but also with Kim and Michael's input, as well as the MPTA board. And then individual agencies also gave us some very valuable input to help shape or reshape them as the case may be. We wanted to develop and balance them to be both aspirational, to push us in stretch goals, but to also be achievable. And they fell into 4 categories: funding, policy and research, data and data collection, and then finally service delivery, operations, and assets. In terms of funding, in the short term, we saw that it was appropriate to return the state levels to the 2002 benchmarks. And Kim, I believe we're there with the new money. I think that is a win, correct?
We're actually over 2002. Right. So yeah, by about 500,000.
That's great. In the short term, we thought it would be appropriate to secure zero matching for immediate vehicle needs, whether that's MoDOT or FTA money or a combination. So in the past, when you had a vehicle need, if you're an agency, you would typically put 20% of your own money to have some skin in the game. I know now it's all you can do to focus on operations, let alone capital replacement. So in the short term, we said it would be advantageous for especially the smaller agencies that have acute vehicle needs if they could have 100% replacement costs, so no money out of their pocket. And for how long that would last and who would actually be the funding, we left it a little vague, but we thought that would be a good idea. In terms of a mid one, increase the funding to be more in line with the neighboring states. And that's going to take a little bit longer, and we're getting there and things are getting better, but we're below the statewide average, if you remember that graph. And to increase the state matching funds for capital. So maybe they should be in the 5 to 10% range. So not the 20% range, but midterm, so agencies would have some skin in the game, but still would have some leeway to devote more of their dollars to actual operations and perhaps a little bit less to the buying of the vehicle on the capital side. And then finally with funding, to look at reworking or re-examining the FTA's 5311 reimbursement regulations and what counts as local match in that particular instance, as well as looking at the 5310 eligibilities criteria, in the long term, since those come from the Federal Transit Administration and would affect not only operators in Missouri, but in all parts of our country. We thought that that would be a longer term discussion and perhaps would be bigger than just MPTA. That might involve the Community Transportation Association or other types of groups that are advocates for folks who have those types of needs. But we saw that those programs now perhaps need some re-examination, especially in this day and age, and it would be good to look at it. In terms of research and policy, we looked at what your all's RTAP does and perhaps what some neighboring states could do, and felt that it was probably appropriate to re-examine or expand that, to have a larger partnership with a research-based university in Missouri that could perhaps do more to alleviate Kim and Michael, and to have maybe perhaps a third-party group that could look at some things. And that, that group or a rescoped RTAP could also help out with some of the other ones in this research and policy category as well, but to also develop an online virtual best practices or data clearinghouse. I know you all are sharing information and are doing it kind of ad hoc, and you call who you know, who you trust, and who you're comfortable with, but maybe it would be a good idea to have this repository available to everybody. And if I'm new to an agency and I'm just getting my feet wet, I don't know people in my neighboring county, but I have an acute need. So rather than just languish there, I can go to this online repository and I can find some answers. If nothing else, I can be assured that I'm not alone in my struggles, which sometimes is also very valuable as well. Don't suffer in silence. Raise your hand and say, I need some help. I'm over my head. Where can I go? Oh, there's an online database that I can look at. Also, too, look at expanding the virtual education opportunities. I know FTA has a lot of training that needs to be done, drug and alcohol awareness, how to deal with belligerent customers, how to deal with folks who have special needs that have to be secured in the vehicle. And when those drivers have to be trained in person, it takes away from their ability to be behind the wheel and deliver that service. So is there a way for them to look at and have those educational opportunities that are needed, but to do it online? Now sometimes the adult education, it's done in little minute sound bites, one little piece at a time. It's not sitting down in front of a Zoom meeting or your computer for hours on end. That tends to be sometimes boring and not very efficient. There's different ways of delivering that, and we ought to explore that. Another one that we thought of was to have a Missouri Transit Summit and solely focused on technical issues and exchange. So to kind of, maybe change the focus of some of this, to have it more interactive, more collaborative, and to really dive down into the weeds and perhaps be driven by the expanded RTAP. So you all could really drive the show as to what you need. And then to research those best practices for service delivery. What are the other folks doing out there throughout the country that could apply to Missouri, that's perhaps cutting edge, that makes sense, and especially with a service delivery focus. So those are the goals and recommendations for funding and research. And I'm going to move ahead to the last two. So in terms of data and data collection, when we were looking at the geographies and the service lines on the map, there is not really a statewide Google Transit feed specification data set. Many of you that are in the bigger agencies, you have that readily available. Those of you that are rural and have multiple counties, it's not as easy to get that. But from our perspective, having that generally available from everyone who populates that in one data set would be interesting to researchers and people like me who dive deep into that data and take a look at it. The same way with the statewide transit asset management plan data sets. MoDOT collects a lot of that information and you all turn it in. It tends to be paper-based, so it has to be digitized and put into a spreadsheet so we can do all that number crunching. It would be lovely if there was just an electronic database. Somebody would have to be in charge of developing and inputting all that data. That would be great maybe for an RTEP postdoc fellow or a grad assistant or an intern maybe to do. It's not some of the most glamorous work, but believe me, it's needed. And that's exactly what we did. We put in all of that data where it wasn't already digitized. Similarly, the statewide provider data set, you all that are full reporters, you turn in a wealth of information to the National Transit Database, the old Section 15, if you remember that. But those of you who are partial providers or you don't have those reporting requirements, you still report data to MoDOT, but it may or may not be digitized or in a format where we can put it into something that we can do all the number crunching. So all of that data, when you have a rich data set and you make that available to people, they do innovative and really cool stuff that we probably haven't even thought of yet to make our lives better and to publish it out there. And then lastly, maybe develop a statewide planning tool like T-Best, which is used in Florida. The Florida DOT has the T-Best tool, which marries a what-if scenario planning tool with vehicles, with drivers, and with money. And when you're trained up on it, it allows you to do some what if scenarios. It's applicable to both urbanized areas at the big city agencies, and I know you probably have other types of proprietary tools, but where this is most valuable is perhaps in the medium and the small size agencies that don't have really big geographies. I think we could probably modify it to handle somebody like Oates' service geography, but just to start down that path, I think would be a tremendous asset or something to look at in the midterm. And then finally, with service delivery operations and assets, it would be great to start biting off that non-programmed rural needs bite in terms of increasing the number of revenue miles and revenue hours. And we focused on revenue because that's when you're actively carrying a passenger. We know that sometimes there's a lot of deadhead miles where you have to move the vehicle and you have to drop someone off and wait for them to do their personal business, their shopping or their doctor appointment, and then you've got to drive somewhere else in some of these counties to go pick people up. But maybe there's a way to do that, and it's tied to the next one to increase the number of passengers per revenue hour. And it's focused on some sort of efficiency model. Just throwing, more and more money, more miles, more hours without some accountability on efficiency, I think we'd get some pushback from some elected officials and others in the state who want some accountability of how the money is being spent. In the third bullet, replace the vehicles so none are beyond the useful life recommendations, and that would be from the FTA. And then lastly, seek to fulfill 5% of the unmet needs within 5 years, and then ramping up to get to 7.5% of the same needs within 10. And then lastly, to get 10% of those unmet needs in 15 years. So I believe that is my last slide there, Kim.
Okay.
So if you want to open it up to questions and answers, I'll do my best.
Okay, so let's jump right in, Sean. We have a couple questions, some comments, and we'll go from there. So the first question was, what transit agencies were used in the comparison with St. Louis Metro Transit?
Ooh, I'd have to go look at that one. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can find out.
Okay, that would be very helpful. And maybe not just Metro Transit in St. Louis, but how were the peer agencies selected for all of the different areas in Missouri to be compared?
So when there's an agency that has any type of reporting to the FTA has a transit comparison tool, and we use that tool and let that tool tell us what agencies are most like the ones in Missouri.
Okay. Okay. So next question, let's see here. Was information pulled from other states, or were the FTA TA Center research referenced for more information and comparisons to assist with these goals and recommendations?
So we looked at a big picture at a 30,000 foot level. We looked at what we knew and my team knew of what other agencies are doing. We had a call with, and I'm blanking on her name, but she was very helpful. She has been in Missouri and she's practiced in other areas. She gave us also some hints. We didn't specifically look at that source per se, but when we gathered some of our recommendations and materials at a high level, they took into account what types of best practices are out there. Does that help that person, I think? Okay.
So another comment was there is already a summit, and we already have an annual conference that we host each year in Missouri. I believe, Sean, correct me, you and your team were focusing on maybe looking at some other ways to disseminate information to the transit industry in Missouri on a more regular basis. And so that is something MPTA will be looking at as well. This is, again, this transit needs assessment study was to deliver us recommendations on how we could be doing things potentially better, how we could gain more insight and information to share with our providers, how we could provide more education opportunities, and how we can deliver more service, especially in light of the critical challenges that the industry is facing: shortage of operators, shortage of vehicles, supply chain issues, shortage of funding. So again, all of the information that's in this report is a way for us to go back and look at how we can do our job better to ensure that the economic impact of public transit and access that we're providing continues to grow in Missouri. Let's see here. We have another. So someone would like to know, was there a rec about software solution to coordinate services? I'm assuming.
So any type of a software?
Yeah, to coordinate services, transit services.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I'd be reluctant to recommend any type of a specific software, because I don't want to sell something that you all may not like. Just from my perspective, it is strange to me that with the programmed services, that someone who has a VA trip need has to be on this bus, and they can't pick me up and take me to the same generalized location because we can't do the accounting side. If a vehicle has a mobile data terminal and we train up the driver or perhaps another person on how to work the mobile data terminal, and split up the fact that Michael's going to the VA trip and I'm going to the one next door for dialysis, and I'm a Medicaid patient, that why can't we share that trip? That makes no sense to me. And I understand that all those programs sometimes are in firewalls and they got to be separated in silos for the money and the accounting, but there's other places out there that are doing much more innovative things and thinking about that problem. So I think not only is it a software problem, it's a regulatory problem, it's a service delivery problem, and it's probably something else that I'm missing with institutional. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try to tackle it. But I think in that instance, it's not just software. It's got some other things and some other nuances. And I hope that answers that person's question.
Okay, great. So I did want to mention, because this has come up in the chat box, and to make sure that everyone on the webinar knows, the full report is now available on the MPTA website at www.mopublictransit.org. That's also in the chat box, the actual link to the website. So the full study report is available now online. I did have a question for you, Sean. In your 30 years experience, what do you think is the most critical finding from this study for Missouri public transit, for us to look at and move forward?
Kim, I think it's the scope and magnitude of the needs, that really there's an unmet need in virtually every corner of Missouri. And I think intuitively we all know that. We always hear that, hey, I need more service. I need more hours. I need more geographic coverage. But now we know it's more than just in Kansas City or St. Louis. It's in every corner of the state. And we know about how many trips. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily take that 39 million as gospel, but it's probably pretty darn close. So the trip needs are in the tens of millions, and the money to do that, is also in the hundreds of millions. There's a big need. You're not alone. But at least now we know, well, how wide and how big is the need?
Okay. One more question. Is there a recommendation on developing more regional networks in various portions of the state with diverse mobility options?
We didn't tackle that one. That would be great if agencies could partner together and somehow, have a more efficient service delivery model, or share vehicles or pool drivers. It's just, sometimes it's kind of hard to do. Oates, for instance, Dorothy has a big geographic area. She'd probably love to have some help. But how do you start an agency like that? If you're an FTA designated recipient, that brings into account a whole host of things that you have to rise up to do. And not every local government or not everyone has the appetite to create an agency to take on that responsibility.
Okay. So I think this might be one final comment. The FTA is very serious about cost sharing and partnerships to lessen the burden on vehicle delays and driver shortage. Were other states reviewed to recommend how this can be done in Missouri?
Again, at a 30,000 foot level, we've had some ideas, but we didn't necessarily focus on, hey, you ought to be doing this. I think, maybe the RTAP in the midterm could be a focus of doing that and seeing what could potentially work for you all. If there are ideas, certainly we, bring them forward to the group, the MPTA, and certainly I'd love to hear them. I'm going to be joining you all in September to present this. We are aware of some, but we didn't necessarily focus on what they are, because I think sometimes we're still early in the doing something different mode. And just because someone is doing something different or having some modicum of success in another place may or may not translate well to Missouri. And we wanted to be cautious of saying, hey, you ought to do this. And I know the one place where we deviated from that was in the T-Best.
So that is all the questions we have today, Sean. I do want to follow up on what Sean just said. We're going to be doing a deeper dive on this study and having more in-depth conversations at several workshops at our upcoming Missouri Transit Conference that is set for September 28th and 29th in Springfield, Missouri this year. So you can definitely check out information on that conference. Is available on the website at mopublictransit.org. Early bird registration does end very shortly, and scholarships are available if cost is an issue with attending the conference. So we are very excited to do some more in-depth discussion. The MPTA board is going to be taking these recommendations and policy changes that have been recommended and looking at what the future next step action items are with regards to that. We're also going to be potentially looking back at that 2019 economic impact study. We've had a few things happen since 2019, including a massive pandemic, and potentially refreshing those numbers as well, so that we continue to move forward with good numbers, good data, and an action plan moving forward on how we can improve public transit and deliver in the state of Missouri. We have had a huge win last week with the governor signing HB 3004. That is a significant win for public transit in Missouri. I heard on social media, someone said to me, that's peanuts. Well, you're right. It is peanuts in the grand scheme of things, but it's 400% more peanuts than we've had in more than 2 decades in Missouri. And so that is really a significant step forward for our providers. They can use that money as matching funds for a part of the Investment Infrastructure Act, the IIJA, with the $91 billion available for public transit, to draw additional dollars down to the state to help with either operating and capital. So every baby step we take is a critical step forward for public transit in Missouri. So we won't be just putting this study on a shelf. There will be action items that come out of it. And I'm happy to say one of the short-term action items has already been accomplished under funding. So we will be moving it forward. Thank you again to Sean and his team at the Lockmuller Group for completing this study. Sean will be in attendance in Springfield in Missouri if you'd like to discuss the study and the findings further in person. Special thanks to our steering committee that represented both rural and urban public transit. They participated throughout the process, weighed in on the recommendations, the policy, the information that was gathered. So the steering committee played a critical role in this study and the development of the results. Special thanks to the MPTA board again for their leadership and all of you who attended today. The study is available online. The study results are available online on the website. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you all for attending this Friday morning.
Kim, one thing real quick, if I may. Anjali had those two questions, and I know Anjali, my colleague Katie Shackelford and I spoke to you, and you were tremendously helpful. We just didn't go deeper down that road because we thought we weren't quite there yet. But that's not to say what you brought up is not important. It absolutely is. And those ideas, and that's kind of what of that, those other best practices summit that we thought about should be shared in the forum. So I hope you're going to be there in September, Anjali. I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Thank you, everyone. And this has been recorded and we will make it available. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.